There is a quiet shift that happens in certain people. It doesn't announce itself loudly, it doesn't come with drama or anger. It arrives slowly, almost invisibly. One day you simply realize that being around people feels heavier than being alone. Not because you dislike them, not because you think you're better, but because something inside you has changed. You have started to see too much. At first, social life feels natural. You laugh when others laugh. You talk about what everyone talks about. You learn the rhythms of conversation, the unspoken rules, the acceptable opinions, the right reactions. But as awareness deepens, cracks begin to appear. You notice how often people speak without meaning what they say. How conversations loop endlessly around the same shallow topics. How silence makes people uncomfortable. Not because silence is empty, but because it forces them to face themselves. And once you notice this, it becomes impossible to unsee. You begin to feel like a guest in conversations you once belonged to. Present, but not engaged. Listening, but not connected. It's not loneliness at first, it's confusion. You ask yourself why gatherings leave you drained instead of fulfilled, why laughter feels forced, why you feel more alive walking alone at night than sitting in a room full of voices. Slowly, the answer forms. Your inner world has grown larger than the space most conversations allow. Most social interaction isn't designed for depth, it's designed for comfort, agreement, distraction, and emotional safety. But a thinking mind doesn't stop at comfort. It asks questions that don't have quick answers. It notices contradictions. It lingers on uncomfortable truths. And that creates distance because depth disrupts the smooth surface of social life. To think deeply while surrounded by people who avoid thinking at all is exhausting. You learn to shorten your thoughts. You soften your insights. You hide the questions that make others uneasy. Over time, this becomes a kind of quiet self erasure. So the mind does what it always does when overwhelmed. It retreats, not dramatically, not bitterly, but deliberately. You stop attending events that feel hollow, you decline conversations that go nowhere, you choose silence over performance. And something surprising happens. You feel lighter. In solitude, there's no need to translate yourself, no need to impress, no need to pretend interest. Your thoughts are allowed to finish themselves. This is when many people misunderstand what's happening. They call it isolation. They call it withdrawal. They assume something is wrong, but inside, something is finally right. Because there is a difference between being alone and being fragmented. Social life often requires fragmentation. You split yourself into acceptable pieces, you edit your honesty, you adjust your tone to fit the room. Solitude, on the other hand, allows integration. You become whole again. Your mind starts to organize. Your emotions stop competing for attention. Your thoughts deepen instead of scattering. This is not emptiness, it's clarity. And clarity is addictive. Once you experience the peace of mental alignment, chaotic interaction feels invasive. Noise becomes unnecessary. Distraction feels like theft. You begin to protect your attention instinctively, not out of arrogance, out of self respect. You realize something most people never question. Not all connection is nourishing. Many people socialize to escape themselves, to avoid silence, to drown out uncomfortable thoughts. But if you are someone who turns inward instead of running away, silence becomes meaningful. In quiet moments, truths surface, questions sharpen, understanding deepens. You begin to see patterns others ignore. How often people speak just to fill space. How often opinions are borrowed instead of formed. How rarely anyone pauses long enough to ask what actually matters. This awareness changes the way you relate to the world. You stop chasing belonging. You stop explaining your need for space. You stop apologizing for not enjoying what drains you. And that's when distance becomes permanent. Not distance from humanity, but distance from noise. You still care. You still feel deeply. But you no longer confuse proximity with connection. You realize that being surrounded by people doesn't guarantee understanding, just as being alone doesn't guarantee loneliness. In fact, many thinkers feel most disconnected in crowds and most connected in silence, connected to their thoughts, connected to nature, connected to something larger than social approval. This is why deeply reflective people often seem detached. They are not disengaged from life. They are engaged at a different depth. They value coherence over popularity, meaning over entertainment, truth over comfort. And this choice comes with a cost. The more aware you become, the fewer spaces feel authentic. The more honest you are with yourself, the harder it becomes to tolerate superficiality. But it also comes with a reward. You stop living reactively. You stop outsourcing your sense of self. You begin to live deliberately. Solitude becomes the place where you meet yourself without distortion, where you confront your fears without distraction, where you explore your thoughts without interruption, where you become accountable only to truth. This is not a rejection of the world, it's preparation. Because once you know who you are in silence, you no longer disappear in noise. And that realization, that quiet distance can be a sign of growth, not failure, is where everything truly begins. As the distance settles in, something else begins to change. At first, solitude feels like relief, but soon it becomes something deeper. It becomes a mirror. Without constant interaction, there is nowhere to hide, no conversations to escape into, no distractions to blur the edges of thought. What remains is the raw presence of your own mind. For many people, this is unbearable. That is why they stay busy, why silence makes them restless, why they fear being alone with their thoughts. But for a reflective mind, this confrontation is inevitable. In solitude, you begin to notice how much of your old social behavior was driven by unconscious motives. The need to be liked, the fear of being misunderstood, the subtle pressure to belong. Without an audience, those impulses lose their power. You start to see how often you once agreed just to avoid friction, how often you stayed quiet to maintain harmony, how often you betrayed your own truth for social comfort. This realization stings, not because you regret the past, but because you finally understand it. Awareness sharpens perception. You begin to notice emotional patterns not just in yourself but in others. How conversations are often negotiations for status. How humor is used to deflect vulnerability. How opinions are repeated because they are safe, not because they are true. And this creates a new kind of separation. Not physical, psychological. You can sit in a room full of people and feel as though you are watching from behind glass. You hear the words, but you also hear what is underneath them. Insecurity, validation seeking, fear of insignificance. This doesn't make you superior, it makes you incompatible. Because once you see beneath the surface, you can no longer pretend the surface is enough. This is where many thinkers begin to feel emotionally distant. Not cold, not numb, but selective. They no longer react automatically, they no longer mirror energy just to fit in. They no longer invest deeply in interactions that lack sincerity. And this restraint is often misunderstood. Others may interpret it as aloofness, as disinterest, as arrogance. But the truth is quieter. The thinking mind has learned that emotional energy is finite. Where you place your attention shapes who you become. So you become careful. You notice that Too much exposure to shallow interaction dulls your sensitivity. That constant noise weakens your ability to think clearly. That emotional overstimulation fractures your inner balance. And once you feel that cost, you stop paying it. This is not withdrawal from life, it is withdrawal from distortion. The more time you spend alone, the more precise your inner compass becomes. You begin to sense when something is misaligned, when a conversation is performative, when a relationship is maintained out of habit rather than meaning. You stop forcing closeness where there is no resonance. And this is where loneliness can appear, not as emptiness, but as consequence. Because depth narrows compatibility. The more clearly you understand yourself, the fewer people you can genuinely connect with. Not because others are lesser, but because alignment is rare. True connection requires shared depth, shared honesty, shared willingness to sit with uncomfortable truths. Most people are not ready for that, so the thinker learns to be alone without bitterness. They stop expecting others to meet them where they are. They stop trying to drag depth into spaces that resist it. Instead, they turn inward, and something remarkable happens. In sustained solitude, the mind begins to reorganize itself. Thoughts grow longer. Ideas connect across time. Insights form slowly but solidly. You begin to understand your own nature more clearly. Your values sharpen. Your tolerances narrow. Your priorities simplify. You realize how little you actually need. You no longer crave constant stimulation. You no longer need to be seen to feel real. You no longer seek approval as proof of worth. This internal independence changes the way you experience the world. When you do interact, you do so intentionally. You listen more than you speak. You choose depth over frequency. And because you no longer need validation, your presence becomes grounded. People feel this. Some are drawn to it, others are unsettled by it. Because a person who is comfortable in their own silence exposes the restlessness of those who are not. This is another reason the thinking individual often feels out of place. Their stillness contrasts sharply with the urgency around them. Their calm highlights the noise others depend on. Their refusal to perform quietly challenges social norms. But the thinker does not rebel outwardly. They simply opt out. They recognize that most emotional suffering comes from resistance to one's own nature, from trying to live as someone else, from forcing connection when solitude is required. And so, they stop resisting. They allow themselves to be as they are. This acceptance brings a deeper peace than social harmony ever did. Not because life becomes easier, but because it becomes honest. Solitude teaches patience. It teaches endurance. It teaches self-trust. When you spend long periods alone, you learn to sit with discomfort instead of fleeing from it. You learn to observe your thoughts without immediately acting on them. You learn the difference between impulse and intention. This is inner discipline. And inner discipline creates freedom. Freedom from needing constant reassurance. Freedom from chasing external meaning. Freedom from living reactively. This is why reflective individuals often appear emotionally distant but inwardly stable. They are no longer tossed around by every social current. They no longer confuse intensity with importance. They no longer mistake noise for life. They have learned to stand alone without collapsing. And that strength does not isolate them. It refines them. By the time they return to the world, they do so differently. They no longer enter seeking fulfillment. They enter with clarity. They no longer seek to belong. They seek to contribute. But that transformation requires one final shift, the most difficult one. It requires understanding what solitude ultimately offers and what it demands in return. That truth comes next. Eventually, solitude stops feeling like a choice. It becomes a calling. Not because the world disappears, but because your relationship to it fundamentally changes. At this stage, something important becomes clear. Solitude is not merely a refuge from society, it is a discipline. When you spend enough time alone, you begin to notice how rarely most people live consciously. How much of life is spent reacting instead of choosing. How often identity is shaped by expectation rather than truth. And you begin to understand why silence is so powerful. In silence, there is no one to deceive, no social feedback to lean on, no applause to guide your direction, no distractions to soften reality. There is only attention. And attention, when sustained, transforms perception. You start to see your own mind with clarity. The habits that once controlled you become visible. The fears that once dictated your choices lose their authority. You realize how often you acted from conditioning rather than intention. This realization is uncomfortable because freedom demands responsibility. Once you see clearly, you can no longer blame circumstances, people, or society for who you are becoming. You recognize that your inner life is your responsibility alone. And this is the turning point. Most people avoid this stage entirely. They return to noise, they re enter distraction, they surround themselves with constant stimulation because it absolves them of the burden of self confrontation. But the thinking mind stays, it stays with the discomfort. It stays with unanswered questions. It stays with the tension of uncertainty. And slowly, something extraordinary emerges. You begin to live from the inside out. Instead of reacting to the world, you respond from principle. Instead of chasing meaning, you generate it. Instead of needing affirmation, you operate from inner alignment. This is not emotional detachment, it is emotional sovereignty. You still feel deeply, perhaps more deeply than ever, but your emotions no longer control you. You observe them, you understand them, you integrate them. This inner stability creates a quiet authority. You speak less, but when you speak, there is weight behind your words. You act less impulsively, but more decisively. You connect less frequently, but more honestly. And when you do return to the world, you are no longer seeking completion. You are complete. This is the paradox most people never grasp. The ones who learn to stand alone become the strongest presence in a room. Not because they dominate, not because they demand attention, but because they are not trying to extract anything from others. They are not performing. They are not compensating. They are not negotiating their worth. Their presence is calm, grounded, intentional. And that presence changes dynamics. Some people are drawn to it instinctively, others feel unsettled by it. Because a person who has faced themselves in silence reflects what others avoid. This is why solitude is often misunderstood. It is seen as withdrawal when it is actually preparation. It is labeled as isolation when it is refinement. It is treated as weakness when it is the source of strength. Those who walk this path do not reject humanity, they simply refuse to lose themselves within it. They understand something essential. You cannot hear your own voice while shouting with the crowd. And once you have heard it, truly heard it, you protect it. You stop over explaining. You stop seeking permission. You stop apologizing for your nature. You no longer measure your life by visibility, popularity, or approval. You measure it by integrity. This is the quiet freedom solitude offers, not escape from life, but ownership of it. And from this place, connection becomes optional, not necessary for survival, but chosen for meaning. You no longer connect out of fear of being alone. You connect out of resonance. You no longer tolerate shallow bonds out of habit. You wait for depth, and if it doesn't appear, you remain whole anyway. This is the final transformation. The realization that solitude was never a punishment. It was training. Training in self-trust. Training in clarity. Training in courage. Because it takes courage to stand alone in a world addicted to noise. It takes courage to think deeply when surface-level thinking is rewarded. It takes courage to live deliberately when distraction is the norm. But those who do are changed permanently. They may walk quietly, they may remain unseen, they may never fully belong, and yet they possess something rare: a grounded mind, a coherent self, a life lived from intention rather than imitation. If this journey felt familiar, it is because you have already begun walking it. If silence feels like home rather than emptiness, it is because your inner world is alive. And if distance has entered your life without bitterness, only clarity, it is not something to fix. It is something to understand. You were never meant to disappear into the crowd. You were meant to become someone who could stand alone and return by choice. And in that quiet strength, everything finally aligns.